I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Slavery was a dehumanizing institution for America's minorities, especially blacks. It wasn't until the late 1950s and 60s that African Americans developed the vision and the will for the civil rights movement to emerge. Their determined struggle against racism and injustice prompted other minorities, including Japanese Americans, to work for justice on their own behalf. Beginning in 1868, Japanese immigrants began fleeing to the United States to escape the ruthless leadership and oppressive systems under which they were forced to live. They came, willing to work hard to secure their families' safety and well-being. Similar to the Japanese on the West Coast in 1942, a minority population, rounded up, forced to board trains, not knowing where they were being taken. Would they be harmed or even killed? Living in constant fear as to what their future and the futures of their children would be. A comparable scenario may be playing out at our southern borders with the incarceration of immigrant families. Children and adults living in fear, separated from one another, confused over where they're to be taken, waiting, worrying about their own safety and the safety of their children. Regarding the racism and injustice behind the rounding up and incarceration of Japanese Americans, President Ronald Reagan, about to sign the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, stated, "The internment of Japanese Americans was a mistake." This leaves Americans with the far-reaching dilemma regarding human rights. Is the rounding up and incarceration of immigrant minorities a justifiable decision or a major mistake? In 1980, inspired by the heroism and the determination of the civil rights movement, a group of Japanese Americans began work for redress and a formal apology for the incarceration of Japanese Americans from the President of the United States.
What happens to minorities in America? And for us, the civil rights movement really was liberating, because what we realized was that we could fight for the things we believed in. We could fight for equality, but we would have to do it each for ourselves. Latinos did it, and later we did it as we began the Redress campaign. But this was not something that was universal during the movement itself. The civil rights movement was about Black America, and rightfully as it should have been.
Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, was organized in 1929 by young Japanese Americans for the purpose of protecting civil rights. The incarceration of 112,000 Japanese Americans and their families, and nearly 8,000 more, held without cause by the Department of Justice and the U.S. Army, had weighed heavily on the membership of JACL. Various ways of dealing with redress and reparation had been discussed over the years, but never formally acted on. All that was to change in Salt Lake City at the 1978 JACL National Convention.
I decided we've talked long enough, and I launched the campaign from the convention. I sent a press release out saying that Japanese Americans were demanding $25,000. The minute we said, we are demanding money, then all of a sudden it became this really kind of ugly issue of, how dare you do this? Most Americans had no idea this had happened. And for me, the focus had to be education, that until we could educate the American public, we would never get a bill through the Congress. But what was really important about the whole campaign was the JSL's discussion always focused on the need to do something so that this could never happen again in this country. And I would tell audiences all over the country that this isn't about money. We don't care about the money. What we care about is that you understand what led us into those camps, why we were imprisoned, and why we lost everything and were willing to come back and do what we could for this country. I put together a committee to talk about how we were going to approach this issue. By then, it was a public issue. It had been picked up by media all over the country, and mainly negative media coverage, like the Wall Street Journal that said, "How dare you do this?" And that was pretty much the nature of most of the media coverage at that point. And so I had a meeting with my committee. Did we want to fight this as a legal issue and go to the courts, or as a public campaign, or what? And in the course of that conversation, there was a man on the committee named Raymond Okamura from Berkeley, a chemist from Berkeley, who said, "Don't you think we ought to ask the 4 Japanese American members of Congress, Daniel Inouye, a United States Senator from Hawaii, Spark Matsunaga, who was also a Senator from Hawaii, and Norman Mineta, a member of Congress of the House, and newly elected to the Congress was Bob Matsui from Sacramento." And about 20 minutes into the meeting, he said, turned to us and said, "Have you fellows ever considered a federal commission?" I hated the idea because, in my view, nothing ever comes of these reports. But Inoue said to us in that meeting, think about the strategy on this. The more I thought about this approach, the more I realized this was probably the only way we had a chance to get anywhere successfully. And so the JSL adopted this position that it would seek a bill to get a federal commission started. Every political pundit we ever talked to said, you're not going to succeed. This is doomed to failure. This has never been attempted in the history of this country before. And the reason it won't succeed is because you have to get Congress, first of all, to acknowledge that there was an injustice. And when has the Congress ever done that?
The JACL committee began its work on a bill to present to Congress, establishing a federal commission to determine the cause behind the wartime relocation and the internment of Japanese Americans.
Both bills got reconsidered after they went into markup and into a conference and went to the White House, and Jimmy Carter approved the bill, signed the bill into law, which created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. Personal Justice Denied was the commission report, and said unequivocally that the internment of Japanese Americans was a consequence of race, of politics, and a failure of leadership.
Spearheaded by the commission report, it was, in the end, what people themselves did to bring about change. The Civil Liberties Act became law because of public pressure, diligence, patience, and a passion for justice, all necessary components in any quest for change.
Members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States. Indeed, scores of Japanese Americans volunteered for our armed forces, many stepping forward in the internment camps themselves. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, served with immense distinction to defend this nation, their nation. Yet back at home, the soldiers' families were being denied the very freedom for which so many of the soldiers themselves were laying down their lives. Congressman Norman Mineta, with us today, was 10 years old when his family was interned. In the congressman's words, "My own family was sent first to Santa Anita Racetrack. We showered in the horse paddocks. Some families lived in converted stables, others in hastily thrown together barracks. We were then moved to Hart Mountain, Wyoming, where our entire family lived in one small room of a rude tar paper barrack. Like so many tens of thousands of others, the members of the Mineta family lived in those conditions not for a matter of weeks or months, but for 3 long years. The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors, surviving Japanese Americans, of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. I'd like to note that the bill I'm about to sign also provides funds for members of the Aleut community who were evacuated from the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands after a Japanese attack in 1942.
Racism as we know it today stems from an attitude that accompanied European settlers to the shores of North America. They believed in the superiority of white Europeans and their culture over those of the native peoples they encountered. This same attitude of superiority, consciously or unconsciously, continues to this day to undermine the human potential of those whose skin color is other than that of white Europeans. Maintaining an attitude of dominance and degradation toward minorities cripples the gift that diversity has to offer and intensifies the loss of greatness for our country.